This story happened when I was 13. My parents raised me very strictly. Despite the fact that I was a kind and decent child and did well in school, I had to be home by 5 p.m. every day, while my peers were having fun outside at that time. I wasn't allowed to invite friends over, and I wasn't permitted to visit anyone after school. I was immediately made to do my homework. I didn't even have a computer. In my free time, my parents made me read books, after which I had to write a short essay about what I had read so that they were sure I actually read them. All of this irritated me a lot. It was cruel and unfair to me. But what hurt me the most was that my parents didn't even feel sorry for me. In their eyes, I saw indifference and not a drop of compassion. My mother was a cruel woman who always made me feel guilty about everything. My father only knew one emotion: rage. We never talked. He would only come up to me to yell at me for bad grades or to beat me for disobedience. But enough about them. Let's talk about my school psychologist. His name is Victor Stevenson. Every student could come to him to talk about problems of any kind, but honestly, I never saw any students talking to Dr. Stevenson. Every day I passed by his office on my way to the cafeteria and peeked into his office through a small crack. He was always alone, working on some documents. I guess that many kids were just afraid to talk about their problems with an unfamiliar adult. I was afraid too. For 2 weeks, I gathered the courage to go to him and voice my problems. During lunch break, I stopped in front of his office door and slightly opened it to peek inside. He looked up, smiled, and waved, inviting me to come in. I entered. He greeted me, introduced himself, and asked for my name. Dr. Stevenson had a very soft voice which made me feel comfortable, and I felt his kindness radiating. I trusted him and told him everything about how my parents were mean and how they didn't care about me at all. The psychologist patiently listened to my story and occasionally nodded his head. Sometime later, my voice started to tremble, and I fell silent. I expected him to start talking about how everything I told him wasn't true and that my parents really loved me and blah blah blah, but everything was different. Dr. Stevenson leaned towards me with a smirk on his face and said, "You know, I'm the best school psychologist in the world. I promise we'll fix everything." I looked at him skeptically. "Okay, but how?" "I have my ways," he said. "I'm a man of my word. I promise that within a month, the relationship between you and your parents will improve forever. But you have to make me one promise. You have to promise me that you'll come to this office tomorrow after school and that you won't tell anyone about our conversation today. This will be our secret." I promised. The next day after class, I came to Dr. Stevenson. After a warm greeting, I sat in a chair, and Dr. Stevenson closed the blinds on all the windows. "Well, now we have the necessary privacy," he said with a smile on his face. We started talking about my hobbies and favorite things, favorite subjects in school, disliked teachers, and so on. After an hour of discussion, Dr. Stevenson offered me a Coke. I gladly accepted, considering my parents never allowed me to drink soda. Dr. Stevenson went to his fridge, grabbed 2 Cokes, and placed them on the table. For some time we drank and discussed my life, but then I lost consciousness from something that Dr. Stevenson had put in my drink. When I woke up, it took me a minute or two to focus on the blurred picture. And when I finally could, I was shocked. I was handcuffed to a bed, and my mouth was taped shut. I began to panic, thrashing and writhing, but soon gave up. I couldn't believe my eyes when I looked around the room I was in. Posters with photos of my favorite artists were hung on the walls. Figurines of characters from my favorite movie were on the shelves. A stack of comics and anime lay on the nightstand. A TV stood in the middle of the room with a Sony console and various games stacked next to it. I didn't know what to think. I was in a room with things that many kids would die for. I would probably have burst into tears of joy if I hadn't been handcuffed to the headboard. My heart nearly exploded from fear when the door opened and Dr. Stevenson walked in. He sat on the edge of the bed. "Okay, listen," he said. "Remember, I'm here to help you, and I would never hurt you, okay?" Dr. Stevenson removed the tape from my mouth and uncuffed me. You'll stay here for a while, and while you're here, you're allowed to play with any toys in this room while I'm home. But when I leave the house, I'll have to handcuff one of your hands to the bed. You can watch TV, but when I'm not here, I want you to watch only news channels," Dr. Stevenson said. I sat frozen, still trying to comprehend what he had just said. "So, go have fun. I'll be back when it's time for dinner." He turned on the TV, stood up and left, locking the door behind him. A few minutes passed before it dawned on me that Dr. Stevenson wasn't joking. All I could do was turn on the console and start playing. Around 7 p.m., Dr. Stevenson returned to the room holding 2 plates of pasta and slices of pizza. I finally mustered the courage and asked how long I would be here. "Well, about a month," he replied. "Give or take a few weeks. I have things I need to take care of." The next morning, Dr. Stevenson woke me up by patting my hand. "You don't have to get up right now if you don't want to, but I need to put these on again," he said, snapping the handcuffs on me. He was dressed in a shirt and wide trousers, with a coat over his shoulder and a suitcase next to him, the same way he dresses for school. Before leaving, he placed the TV remote next to me and told me to turn it on and watch the news. The first thing I saw on the screen was a breaking news segment. A police officer stood surrounded by people with microphones. This is what he was saying. "This morning a search party was launched. So far there are few clues. Teachers claim the girl was last seen around 4 or 5. I felt nauseous when my picture appeared on the screen. Above my photo were changing captions. Police begin search for child. Kidnapper's identity unknown. Possible runaway." The live broadcast continued, and I saw 2 figures I recognized as my mom and dad. Both had red eyes, tears streaming down my mother's face as she took the microphone. She sobbed on live television saying, "Please bring my child back. I'm sorry. Please come home." When my father took the microphone, I expected him to be as cold as ever, but there were tears in his eyes. "I know I haven't been the best father, but damn it, I promise I'll be better. Please bring our daughter back to us." I turned off the TV. My emotions were mixed, as I had never seen my father cry. I felt guilty that my parents had to go through this, but at the same time I felt relieved. Now I knew how much my mom and dad loved me. Dr. Stevenson took care of me for nearly 4 weeks. In the morning, he would leave me handcuffed to the bed but return in the afternoon to have lunch, talk, and play together. But one morning, when Dr. Stevenson woke me up before leaving, I noticed tension on his face. I also realized that he had woken me up 3 hours earlier than usual. "You need to watch the news today. I want you to pay close attention to the TV all day," he said grimly, turned on the TV, and left. About 2 hours later, the commercials ended, and a breaking news broadcast began. It was reported that human remains had been found. "This morning, we regret to inform you of tragic news in the case of the missing child. Remains were found in a trash bag on the side of the highway. The body belongs to a child. It was also decapitated and burned to ashes. Inside the bag, police found a school ID card." The screen showed the school card I always carried in my backpack. The plastic was slightly burned and melted around the edges, but my photo and name were recognizable. The camera shifted to my parents, who were sitting among the journalists. My mother's face showed pain, and my father had his face buried in his hands. I turned off the TV. Dr. Stevenson came very late that night. He rushed into the room, freed me from the handcuffs, and handed me a glass of fizzing water. He put his hand on my shoulder and smiled. "I kept my promise, didn't I?" I nodded, holding back tears. "Now you need to make me one more promise," he said. He told me to drink all the water in the glass. It would make me fall asleep, and from now on, I must never tell anyone that I ever met him. I promised and started drinking. "I told you I'm the best school psychologist in the world, didn't I?" And he was right. Later, I found myself lying in the middle of a park, staring up at the stars shining in the sky. I recognized the park. It was near my school. After walking about a kilometer along the road, I saw my house. The lights were off, but I saw my parents sitting on a bench near the entrance. They were devastated. I called out to them. and when they saw me, they immediately jumped up and ran toward me with open arms, shouting my name. Dr. Stevenson was right. Things at home have changed for the better. My parents smile more often and take care of me. Finally, I'm happy. Sometimes I see Dr. Stevenson at school. From time to time, he winks at me and smiles, and I keep my promise pretending I've never seen him. But ever since then, one question has been tormenting me, a question I can't get out of my head. Who did Dr. Stevenson decapitate and dump by the highway?